while a poll today suggests 40% of Tory councillors nationally are preparing to vote for the Brexit Party. Meanwhile, Labour's Deputy Leader Tom Watson says his party cannot sit on the fence and must be prepared to offer voters a confirmatory ballot on any deal. For more on this, I'm joined by Femi Oluwole, who's the co-founder of Our Future, Our Choice, and Trixie Sanderson, who's political commentator and former advisor to Nigel Farage. Femi, let's start with you. Are you surprised at how popular this Brexit Party seems?
Well, it's a simple proposal. Unfortunately, the sad thing is, he's soaking up votes and support from people that have nothing to do with him. I mean, Nigel Farage does not speak for or represent most Brexit voters. It's been my privilege to go around the country and meet Brexit voters, and they are reasonable, decent people who would be disgusted by what Nigel Farage represents. Nigel Farage with his Breaking Point poster, it's more important to remember, people call that poster racist. The UK isn't part of the EU's common asylum policy, which means that those people in that poster, the Syrians that he showed, had nothing to do with Brexit. He chose specifically people of Syrian descent to scare people about immigration from EU countries. It was fundamentally racist. Most people, most decent Brexit voters, have nothing to do with that, yet he's soaking up votes because he's called it the Brexit Party.
Trixie, what do you think? Do you think he's representative of Brexiteers across the country?
I think the polls show for themselves that he's representative of Brexit voters. He's come back into politics. I advised him in 2016 not to leave because the referendum result isn't being honoured. I think it's ridiculous to say he doesn't represent Brexit voters when what people voted for was the chance to have a free, independent nation that can make its own trade policy. That's not what Theresa May's withdrawal agreement wants. Labour want a customs union and now apparently a second referendum. One of the key issues in that referendum was about immigration, and going around accusing people of being racist just polarises the argument further.
I literally just explained why it was racist. The UK is not part of the common asylum policy, which means that the only people who can come to this country under EU law are people who look like Nigel Farage, people from Poland, people from Bulgaria. Yet he chose specifically people from Middle Eastern backgrounds to scare people about immigration. So why did he choose people who have nothing to do with Brexit to scare people about immigration? Could it be perhaps what they look like?
I'm sure you're aware that free movement of people means that anyone who was within the EU can come into the UK.
It literally doesn't.
Femi, please, look, I've seen some of your stuff on Twitter saying that trade policy is about physics and things like that. You know,
no, you've just said
you're not sorry. Wrong. Please let me finish. Please let me finish.
Go for it.
If you read the legislation 2004/56, if you're interested, it says that free movement is for anyone who is within the EU. Now, having spent time
Sorry, no, I'm not going to allow you to say fake news on national television. It is for EU citizens.
I'm reading from the legislation, Femi.
Those people who were showing in that photograph, those Syrian refugees, are not EU citizens, which means they had no right to enter this country under EU law. It applies to citizens of EU countries. They are not citizens of EU countries. So what you're saying is fundamentally fake news.
Okay,
let's also remember this idea that once they...
Okay, so Femi is basically saying that if you're not an EU citizen, that you can't have free movement. Trixie, what do you say?
As I was trying to say, when I went to the camps in northern France, a lot of people in the camps, primarily men of economic working age, weren't from the EU. They had been given access, so they come in from Italy, from Malta, from Spain, from places like that. They then have access to travel within the EU. They are being trafficked there by criminal gangs. They weren't told that they couldn't have access to the UK. They were there waiting to be trafficked into the UK. I was there in the camps. I saw these with my own eyes. I went to the port of Calais and spoke to the people in charge about the problems they were facing. If you get access to the EU, I know from friends in Malta that their policy has been when migrants come into Malta, they know they don't want to stay in Malta, they give them Maltese passports because then they have access. This is also happening with satellite states. You cannot say that a piece of legislation that's written in black and white stops people from outside the EU getting access to the EU under the common asylum policy, and therefore travelling up the country into the UK, because it happens, because I've seen it with my own eyes.
You just described illegal trafficking, i.e. things that break the law, and you're saying that we need to get rid of EU law to combat it. Those people have no right to enter this country unless they are EU citizens, which means that leaving the EU changes nothing. Our borders are controlled by UK border force. You are talking about people who are getting on the backs of lorries, which has nothing to do with the EU. In fact, logically speaking, the more cooperation that we have with EU countries, the better able we will be to stop illegal immigration. So again, if they're given
first of all, the treaty between France and the UK regarding the main problem in Calais is actually a bilateral treaty, not an EU treaty. So that's not EU.
Yeah.
Secondly, the people are in France. How do you think they got from France? They travelled legally from areas in southern Europe.
But with no right to enter the UK. We are not
which
part of
they
Schengen,
will
which
do.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in there because I feel that we can just carry on debating this for many days. Let's look to what Tom Watson had said in The Observer today and what he said about Mr. Farage. Femi, he said he's never accountable for his promises. Although he sucks most of his support out of both his old party, UKIP, and the Conservatives, he still presents a challenge to Labour. Femi, do you think he presents a challenge to Labour?
Well, I think that he claims to speak for the working class. He claims to speak for those areas that have been left behind. So, for example, if we take an area such as Sunderland, in fact, he did that march from Sunderland down to London. And so the idea is that he's competing for the vote of the working class, but he does not represent the working class. I mean, I find it insulting that he did that march because it was actually supposed to sort of emulate the Jarrow March from about 100 years ago, where they marched from Jarrow in the northeast down to London, basically saying that the northeast deserves a chance, that there need to be more jobs in those areas that have been left behind. And clearly, we haven't fixed that in 100 years. But the fact is, Nigel Farage has bluntly said that it is not his issue whether or not Brexit makes us poorer, which means what happens to that area if Brexit makes us poorer, it means it's a fundamental betrayal of that. What we need to do is work for those areas. If we leave the EU on a no-deal situation, that means that, for example, the Nissan factory that sends 70% of its cars to mainland Europe, 35,000 jobs across the northeast depend on that factory. Now, if there is a barrier between us and where they send 70% of their cars, if you own Nissan, where would you want your factory to be? Would you want 70% of your cars to face a cost if it's based here? Or would you want it based in Frankfurt, where only 30% of your cars would face a cost going the other way? Now, if he doesn't care, if he says, I'll give a direct quote, when I'm asked about, are we going to be richer or poorer with Brexit? You know what my answer is? What price freedom? What price liberty? What price our identity as a country? He doesn't care if Brexit makes us poor. He doesn't care what happens to the working class. So Labour needs to say, all right, if Brexit is going to result in the people in those areas that have been left behind, that desperately need real investment and real jobs in their area, if that's what's going to happen, then they cannot, as a party of the working class, allow any version of harmful Brexit to get through. And the only way we prevent that is a referendum where we say, all right, in 2016, we voted to leave the EU, but Brexit was 4 words in 2016. Leave the European Union. Right now, it's a 585-page treaty, which most people who voted for Brexit do not like. The most democratic thing we can do at this point is let the people decide whether or not the Brexit that's actually on the table is actually what they want. Because I'll put this to Trixie. Can she guarantee that every single person who voted for Brexit wanted the sort of Brexit that she's proposing?
Can you guarantee that everyone who voted Remain thinks that the government ignoring the will of the people is a good thing? That's a ridiculous thing to say.
Nobody's ignoring the will of the people.
Oh God, here we go again.
I asked you a question. Please answer my question.
And I just answered it. So if I may address the point about the North and the working class and Labour voters, please, Femi, please.
I asked you the question.
Thank you.
Please answer my question.
Oh my God. I have answered your question, and now I'd like to talk about the subject we were talking about, which was voters in the north of England and Labour voters, and what Tom Watson has said today. 61% of constituencies held by Labour voted for Leave. What Lord Adonis has said when he said he didn't want Leave voters voting for Labour in the EU elections, what Tom Watson has said today is made it clear that anyone who supports Leave shouldn't vote Labour. If you want to remain, vote Liberal Democrat. If you want to leave, vote Brexit Party. Vote UKIP if you particularly want to. If you haven't made up your mind, vote Tory, because I don't think they have either. But the point is that Leave would not have won without that working class vote. And it's so patronising from people centred around London who've done a few months stagiaire in the European Commission to say, I know who speaks for the working class.
Sorry, I was born in Darlington and grew up in Birmingham, so I'm not centred around London in any way.
So I wasn't talking about... Stop making everything about you.
Femi, Trixie, I'm going to have to break in there. Thank you so much both for chatting to us, and happy Easter to both of you.
Happy Easter to you.
Thank you. Happy Easter.
Thank you. You're watching Sky News.